Shelagh Whitley, Head of Climate at ODI. Thank you so very much for agreeing to an interview. How are you?
Good, thank you. Thank you for having me.
It's a great pleasure. So Shelagh, you've done so much on this issue of fossil fuel subsidies, which I want to write about in the book. And I wanted to start by asking you to explain to a non-expert listener like me, what is this issue and why is it so important and what can we do about it?
Well, I guess maybe the easiest way to talk through it is sort of how I came to work on it in the first place. So I have been working on climate and energy issues for, I guess, almost 15 years. And a lot of my work has been focused on the role of the private sector, private investors, private finance. I worked for quite a long time also in the carbon markets. And I came to ODI to kind of study how you get the private sector to act and invest around kind of positive aspects of climate change. So how do you get them to invest in renewable energy and things like this? And quite quickly, I saw that a lot of the levers that governments have to move private actors and move private money are actually going in what I would say for climate change in the wrong direction. And one form of these and kind of one envelope that you would use to describe these instruments is fossil fuel subsidies. So this is how governments use budget, so their own money, sort of taxpayers' money, and other tools like loans and grants to support the private sector. And at the moment, most of that support is going to, or the majority of the support in the energy sector still goes to oil, gas, and coal. And those are fossil fuel subsidies. So I kind of brought my work and the focus of my work to understanding those and figuring out how governments can use those tools differently, because we often hear governments don't have money or resources to support action on climate. But when you start to look at fossil fuel subsidies, you see that they actually have a lot of resources and a lot of different tools and levers, but they're just using them to still support kind of a centuries-old energy system.
And the order of magnitude of fossil fuel subsidies around the world?
Yeah, it's a great question. I guess the best estimate, and obviously because this is data that's all over the world, and one of the biggest problems with the work on subsidies is that because governments often will prefer these to be hidden, we don't have amazing data on this. We have quite good data for the richest countries in the world, so the OECD countries. But if you add it all together, looking at different estimates from different institutions, it's around 600 billion a year. It has gone down recently, mostly due to falls in oil, gas, and coal prices. But it's quite a significant,
incredible number.
Sum of money. And it's about double what you see in terms of renewable subsidies. But again, the estimates for those aren't great either.
And what has the world said it's going to do to address the fossil fuel subsidies?
So we have a few different places, which is encouraging, where governments have said they're committed to action on subsidies. One is in the G20, so the 20, again, richest countries of the world have said every year since 2009 that they were going to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies. We have the G7 who've made the same commitment. They made an even more, let's say, ambitious commitment by calling on all the countries in the world to end fossil fuel subsidies by 2025. Mexico, the US, and Canada made a similar commitment last year together. And we have places in other agreements where we see action on fossil fuel subsidies. So, for instance, the Sustainable Development Goals have eliminating fossil fuel subsidies as one of the tools for achieving the SDGs.
Great. And is there an argument about what should be done with that money instead, or are you agnostic about that? What's the case?
It's a good question, and some of my colleagues here at the Overseas Development Institute spend a lot of time thinking about that. I think most would say that you shouldn't use it for a specific purpose. So that's often called hypothecation. So you shouldn't hypothecate those resources to something specific. There's a lot of work that some of my colleagues do at an institute called the Global Subsidies Initiative, which looks at modeling and how you can reallocate resources. So what it means for the climate if you say reallocate a portion of those savings to energy efficiency or to renewables. And that obviously creates a much bigger increment in terms of impact, in terms of greenhouse gas emission savings. But most people who work in kind of the public budgeting space would say don't hypothecate it. What we often see, and I think this is because rhetorically there's a lot of space in the subsidy reform space, I think, to talk about how budget can be used differently. So, and there needs to be a belief on behalf of citizens of a country that if they're not getting because some subsidies come directly to consumers, so that means even here in the UK we have only a 5% tax on energy, which is lower than our regular VAT. People want to know if their taxes are going up or if their energy prices are going up, that something else is going to be offset. So are my healthcare costs going to go down? Am I going to get better education for my family, et cetera, et cetera? So what you often will see is what you need is sort of transparency around how that money is being used, but in a kind of proper budget cycle planning. I don't know if that answers the question.
It does.
So you then want governments to say, we can use it for different things, but we commit to returning this as public goods.
So it's not the case, it's not an environmentalist case per se of shifting the 600 billion from fossil fuels to renewables, but it's not a direct transfer.
I think it depends on what part of the subsidies you're talking about. So I do think there's space. So there's direct budget spending and tax breaks, and that's kind of the fiscal system of a country, which often you would want to see used, as I said, in a way that's more neutral and is going towards whatever public good makes sense and not choosing one. But then when you have other instruments, a portion of which are subsidies, so public finance, as I mentioned, so our big public financial institutions like the World Bank, some bilateral institutions like OPIC, for instance, in the US, they give grants and loans to companies. They support activities overseas. That public finance actually could be changed one-to-one. So instead of, because they're already focused on the energy sector, instead of funding a gas pipeline, they could fund a renewable project. And there's also subsidies provided through state-owned enterprise. So state-owned companies could direct their developments in the energy sector away from oil and gas, potentially to renewables. And you see that, for instance, in the case of Norwegian energy company Statkraft. They are a state-owned energy company, and they are focused on renewable power. You obviously have Statoil, which is focused on the oil piece. And so how will a country like Norway use its state companies, which is a form of subsidy, to shift in this energy space?
Great, thank you. Are there any examples around the world of countries which have enacted fossil fuel subsidy reform and done so in a way which has been accepted or beneficial or progressive as a beacon to others? I'd like to write about such examples if there are any.
Yeah, there are examples. I think, as in any examples, there's always parts of it that are kind of good and exemplary and things that you would do differently. I think it's the case with all policy reform processes. All policy reform processes are, I hate to use this word because it's not a great word, complicated, because everything is really complicated, but policy reform processes will have gone well and not so well in different ways. I think what we see that's really interesting, and we've done some work on this with the new climate economy, is that you see progress actually on almost all forms of subsidy if you look across a vast number of countries in the world. So there's some country that's done a reform in a certain area. We haven't seen a country eliminate all fossil fuel subsidies. So there basically isn't a country that's gotten rid of all of these instruments. But some examples that are, I think, quite interesting is there's many good and interesting examples. One is in the case of India, where they have reformed fossil fuel subsidies to consumers. And one of the things that they did was this very massive advertising campaign, which was about giving up the subsidy. So what they did was instead of mandating the removal of the subsidy, they made it voluntary, and it's based around gas cylinders, and everyone gets these, and at a subsidized cost, and they are the rich get them and the poor get them, and it became a kind of movement of wealthier or middle class families giving this up and saying, we don't need this subsidy, so that it can be reallocated to the poor. And if you go to places like Delhi, you would see these posters for this campaign everywhere. And I think one of the lessons that has been learned, and it's been learned in many cases, is that the communications piece of this is so important, that this is about kind of social change, behavioral change, just as much as kind of energy policy. And and that there is a power in terms of actually, if people understand what a subsidy is, who it's going to, and recognizing that they don't need it, that there's actually a willingness to give it up.
Very interesting. I remember growing up in the UK, and there was a protest about fuel tax rise. I think it was in the Brown era. And it was a very modest rise from memory, and yet it caused the most terrible, national kind of breakdown in the sense of the lorry drivers going on strike and so on. How interesting to hear of another way of selling the story in a way which culminated in a better result.
Yeah, and we see this there have been protests in Mexico over the past few weeks because of a change in rise of fuel. We see protests in Nigeria, and often in the case of subsidy reform, those are the stories that are pointed to. And I think a lot of this is linked to more this potential mistrust that the government is going to take those funds and give them back to the people in a different form. And all they see is their overall costs going up, as opposed to a rebalancing and a lack of understanding of why. Yeah.
I've heard it said that the current oil price globally is a perfect opportunity for countries to implement fossil fuel subsidy reform. Would there be a better time than the...
No, I think there is definitely, and there has been a lot of movement in terms of new reform processes because of oil and gas prices going down, that it then means that it's easier to keep those prices, because what was happening was you had the reason the subsidies were there was to make the difference between high oil prices and what kind of was seen to be an affordable or a reasonable price. The risk is, though, and we know this, is that these prices go up and down. So there's a risk also that countries now will have maybe done some reforms, but they will backslide, and we often see that. So countries will have, we did some quite interesting studies looking at actually how support for education has been linked to subsidy reform, and finance for education as part of the Education Commission's work, led by Gordon Brown, and basically that you always see these episodes, so high, low prices, subsidy reforms being put in place, and then subsidy reforms being rolled back. What we need is reforms that happen in a way that don't allow for that kind of backsliding, and that you have these other support systems in place, so you're not using a fossil fuel subsidy to, say, deal with energy pricing, and that can include cash transfers to the poorest. In the case of where we live here in the UK, that includes supporting insulation of buildings, and you're not talking about lower fuel costs, you're talking about a lower need for fuel. So that's, I think the trick is also not seeing this as a one-time moment, but structuring the reform in a way that it's sustainable.
Great. Are there other countries where it's happening? I think I read about Indonesia at some point was looking at the issue, and Morocco perhaps, and others.
Yes, yeah. There's examples, and I'm probably not the best person to talk about the detailed reform examples. There's been, in the case of Indonesia, the reforms took place, and again were linked to developments in the healthcare sector, so these kind of health cards, access to health. There's also those were done in the transport sector. Indonesia is an example as well, where some of the plans for budget use during the course of the reform were directed towards infrastructure. So there was a big push that this will then go into, the funds can be used. It's dealing with a budget, kind of a budget crunch, but then the budget could be used towards infrastructure in Indonesia. The risk then is, do you use that money for high carbon infrastructure? And some of our colleagues have been working on how can you make sure that real allocation doesn't go to lots of highways or polluting power plants, etc., but that goes to green infrastructure. So there's good stories from the Indonesia case in that they managed to put the reform through without a lot of pushback, but then it's a question of how will that budget be used and again, I'm talking just from a climate perspective in a way that's positive for the environment. I think we also see countries who are working through, because we work on both sides of there's obviously subsidies that more go to consumers, so in terms of your price of gasoline, your end price of electricity, but there's also subsidies that go to producers. So the companies that actually get oil, gas, and coal out of the ground. And obviously there's been a lot of protests around the world against certain projects, the tar sands in Canada where I come from, and there are governments who've also tried to pull back on those subsidies. And we see that in, here again in the UK, that happened, some of that started to happen back in the 80s, linked to kind of coal mining here, and we know that wasn't done well. In Germany, it's been happening more slowly, but they are in the process of removing subsidies to coal mining in Germany. But it's taken decades, and so the question is also how can we speed up these processes in a way that doesn't negatively impact communities? And so I guess I would say there are definitely stories of progress, but we're really still in I guess, in a learning phase, and as this is a really tricky issue, there's not a lot of resources that go to support studying these things. So trying to make sure that this becomes more part of basic work around kind of climate change and the energy transition is really important.
Very interesting, because it would be a huge win. I mean, it's of an order of magnitude sort of beyond anything else, really, what one feels. You mentioned Canada, and I can't resist asking about, there was an interesting piece in the paper, I think, yesterday about Mr. Trudeau and his comments on tar sands, and what's the view in Canada?
Yeah, it's tricky. The government came in with basically the election platform said that they were going to end fossil fuel subsidies. But even in the past year of being in power, they've actually extended an existing subsidy. Now, the Canadian government is, I think, and I don't know if this is the right word to use, I think trying to make pragmatic decisions on climate in terms of what are the wins and how can they achieve those, and they're working really hard around carbon pricing. And I think they have put carbon pricing first and are doing things like approving pipelines and extending some fossil fuel subsidies as what they see as a pragmatic choice on climate. I would argue they shouldn't need to do that. They should be able to do both at the same time. And that focusing on just the demand side of climate, which is sort of the carbon pricing side, while still working on supply and digging this stuff out of the ground is really problematic. And that is, that although there's a lot of other reasons why I think our current government in Canada is very exemplary in the world, on this, they can really take a leadership stance. And I think this moment is actually quite critical. We have, up to now, Obama was really leading, and the US government was really leading within the G20 on actually getting a deadline for the end of fossil fuel subsidies that would be agreed by these countries. And we are unlikely to have that leadership now in the US, so we need champions. And Trudeau and his government can play that role, but that requires walking the walk as well.
Yes, very, very clear. And I recall that Rex Tillerson in the hearings, when asked about fossil fuel subsidies, implied that, or said he didn't know that such things existed.
Yeah.
Which was odd. But
I think we're fortunate in that case. I mean, we're not fortunate that he said that, but both China and the US went through, under the G20, what's called a peer review process. So last year, they basically looked at each other's fossil fuel subsidies. And so we have a Chinese inventory of subsidies and a US inventory of subsidies, which are basically signed off by the governments. The OECD, which is this kind of large, think tank of kind of the richest countries in the world, has also done these very detailed inventories, which are also signed off by government. So I would say the evidence is there, but Rex Tillerson is not the only person who says things like this.
No.
The British government says it does not have any fossil fuel subsidies, even though the OECD has a detailed inventory of the UK's fossil fuel subsidies. So that becomes a definitional issue, which is easily punctured. We have a definition of subsidies under the World Trade Organization that every country in the world pretty much has signed up to. And there are subsidies to fossil fuels both in the US and the UK. But it is, they would say, oh no, that's just part of the tax code. But of course, if you paid 10% less tax than I did, your life would be subsidized, right? I mean, it's quite obvious when you take it to, I would have X amount of money every month. That would be greater. But it can be kind of obfuscated, I think, quite easily by some of these people.
Very interesting. So we have at the same time a sort of global understanding and agreement, or a growing one, about the importance of this issue, thanks in no small part to the work that you and ODI has done positioning this issue. And yet, when the rubber hits the road, to use that old phrase, on the ground in every country and every political economy, the arguments are only just beginning, really. So this is the project of the next 5-10 years, is it? Or do we have that time? We've got to.
Well, I think our timeline, I guess, has been to 2020, which of course for all of us is getting closer and closer every day. We have been pushing very hard for the G20 to put a 2020 deadline. As I said, the G7 have said 2025, but we did have a number of governments who were close to agreeing on 2020. I think the key here is that this all fits together. So these are, as I said, this multiplicity of tools that governments use. They've been using this, and I think the evidence just shows that the existing energy system we've had for century plus has needed this support. So recognizing we wouldn't have the lights on in the room we're sitting in if this support wasn't there. So I think we need to recognize actually how much government support it takes to run an energy system, and that those things are going to need to be used differently. Those tools need to be used differently. So we need to think differently about how much government support it actually takes to get a clean, renewable energy system, full electrification of the transport system, all these things that we think we need for the energy transition. So all these tools need to shift, and that this kind of goes together, right? So when we have carbon pricing, actually subsidies are a negative carbon price. So you need an even higher carbon price to offset fossil fuel subsidies. So the more we get rid of fossil fuel subsidies, the easier it is to potentially carbon price. The more we get rid of fossil fuel subsidies, the more investments look attractive to different people. So I suddenly say, oh, well, if that thing's not as subsidized, I'm going to move my money somewhere else, which means investor behavior changes and money goes in a different direction to clean alternatives. So we're not going to get, I don't think, one day subsidies end and everything. It's going to be a process whereby we're unwinding this government support and ramping up support in other areas, and it will be kind of joined up. What we need to do is, as I guess you've said, is it too late? I mean, we need to hold government to account, because if we can get the transparency, the clarity of what's there, it's much easier to push governments on the subsidies that are the most egregious first. How can we move things so that, yes, maybe there might be one small instrument that protects one special interest group, because actually it's reasonable to have that for a few more years while the rest of the system is shifting.
And the argument has to be won at the level of every nation. Is this a country?
I think it has to be. It has to be one not even as it needs to be one beyond the level of every nation. So yes, I would argue that the place, and this is the work that we do, is very focused on specific countries and regions at the moment. It should be in every country in the world, but it also gets down to certain areas of. So in the UK, part of this story will be about the North Sea. And the shift away from oil and gas. It will be stopping fracking and trying to figure out at community levels what the alternatives are. So it is very, very place-based, and along with being kind of a national focus, along with being part of these international processes. And different groups are obviously better placed to take that on. I mean, most of ODI's work is focused on the G20 or focused on certain countries, but also kind of connecting them to peers, to feeding kind of understanding of how that works. So, for instance, one of the things we're doing now is focusing on Europe, and then working with groups in specific countries to then take a lot of this forward, because they're much better placed to work in their kind of with governments, with industry groups, etc.
Fantastic. Yeah. And is Mrs. Merkel good on fossil fuel subsidies?
I think it's interesting because obviously Germany is hosting the G20 this year. And we were having a conversation recently trying to get a sense of, now that the US, there's a new US administration, what does this mean? Where will the champions be? I think the challenge for Germany is that by hosting the G20, they are working across multiple agendas. So I do think, as I said, they have a plan to remove subsidies to coal. I do think, obviously, Germany is one of the most progressive countries in terms of the development of its energy system, but they can't take this. They've got to work on refugees. They've got to work on, the issues with regards to Europe and Brexit. There's so many issues that they are definitely a supporter, but I don't think they are going to push all the governments to fix to a 2020 deadline. I think if there were other champions in the form of a few other countries, Germany would be there with them. But I'm not sure. We're not sure that they're able to take the lead because there's too many. Other topics this year. Certainly.
Are you encouraged by the Chinese direction of travel on subsidy? I mean, obviously it's a broader story about renewables and everything else, but
absolutely. I mean, the fact that that China and the US did this subsidy peer review together is really, really important, and I do think there is potential. There, and at the moment we have the way that these summits work is that even though the G20 summit is happening in July, most decisions happen as of March. So what we're working on right now is figuring out where within these different administrations are there champions, and could there be a critical mass brought together? and China definitely could be, is a leader. And what you often see, and we see this obviously in the climate negotiations as well, is there's a difference between domestic leadership and action and the role that governments want to play in international fora. So it's trying to navigate that and also recognizing that some governments won't come out necessarily and be a champion in an international fora, but it's actually quite amazing what they're doing at home.
Yes, yeah.
So
very interesting.
We'll
So you've been working on this for a number of years, but I recall throughout 2015 in the run-up to Paris a lot of work that you were doing and that ODI and the then director Kevin Watkins was doing on fossil fuel subsidies. And I really do feel that you sort of put the issue on the global map, and others have taken it on to IEA and so on. But what was it like to do that, and how is it to construct? What's involved in constructing a narrative of this kind and putting the argument out there?
It's really hard to say because I think at least for me this work is very personal. So I guess having worked on climate at that point for almost a decade, when the reason I came to work on fossil fuel subsidies was in part also due to the work that was kicked off in 2012 around the divestment movement. So Bill McKibben wrote this article called Global Warming's Terrifying New Map.
Yes, amazing.
And that was very focused on companies. So how do we get our investments out of companies, private actors getting investments out of private companies? And I thought, again, well, the governments must have something to do with this. And when I looked into the topic very superficially, I was just really shocked that it wasn't something that every single person who worked on climate was talking about. So it seemed to me that we had to get anyone who was thinking or talking about climate to talk about fossil fuel subsidies. And I think because it got me kind of, fired up, it seemed an obvious piece of work. I think that the thing about how then we got this coalition together. So we work with, as I said, the Global Subsidies Initiative. We work with a group called Oil Change International, who are based in the US. We work with the Natural Resource Defense Council, also out of the US. And as a group, I think we felt there was sort of international institutions who were working on this and far more on consumption subsidies, but there wasn't enough focus on production subsidies, as I mentioned before. So how we support companies to get oil, gas, and coal out of the ground. And in the context of 2 degrees, well, now we've agreed in Paris that we want to keep ideally to no more than 1.5 degrees. If you look at 2-degree warming scenario, we need to keep 3/4 of fossil fuels in the ground. If we need to keep 3/4 of fossil fuels in the ground, there can't be a more perverse activity than subsidizing getting oil, gas, and coal out of the ground. And also, we know that governments are sort of are hiding this and want to hide this. And so I think it's more that just there's the argument is so compelling that we had to just put it out there and we had to show. So what we've done is our work is a transparency exercise. So it's just highlighting numbers and information, country by country, instrument by instrument. And I think that obviously it was compelling, and it's information that is almost sitting there, and there's so much of this. It's sort of sitting there in different, more technical documents. Governments find ways of it's all in these budget documents that no one wants to take time to look through. But if you do that, then it's just powerful messaging that then others in this space can use. And I guess that's what you're saying. You've seen reflected that the data that we pulled together based on this really almost horrifying information that governments are saying they're going to address climate change, and then at the same time subsidizing the activities that are driving it. And I think now it's amazing because that's what we wanted really. Ideally, we don't just want the people who work on climate to talk about this, we want everyone to talk about it, but the climate community was the first place where it was kind of the most absurd that it wasn't being discussed.
Yes, and it would be great to have more finance ministers talking with propriety about this issue. Maybe Philip Hammond is a good candidate for that. Well, Shelagh, thank you very, very much. Really inspiring, and really do want to write about this issue in my book, so we'd be grateful for your advice.
Absolutely. Thanks
Good
so
luck
much.
with the effort. Yeah.
Good luck with your book.
Thank you very much.